Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Christina Graves, and I am the president of the NCMA Boston chapter. Fun fact, the Boston chapter is the oldest, longest running chapter in NCMA. It has a rich history of providing innovative and tailored training. Speaking of which, we have a great one for you today. Without further ado, our VP of Broadcasting, Adam, will introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Christina. Folks, welcome. We're so happy to have you here. I'm Adam Cohn. I'm the Vice President of Broadcasting and Marketing here at NCMA Boston. And allow me just to give you a quick tease. This is where we'd have our VP of Programs come in, tell you a little bit about the program year we have coming up. Of course, we have our 64th annual March workshop coming up next year. We're in the planning stages for that now. Very excited to be bringing that to you all. Also, if you saw my teaser video, I've got the first ever AI in Contracting Conference coming up here at NCMA Boston. That is going to be on November 20th, 2024. From 8:30 a.m. until 1:15 p.m. The actual event's from 9 a.m. to 1:15 p.m. Eastern. There is going to be a networking session to that first half hour. Think of it like a mini March workshop like you've been at any other conference. We're going to be utilizing a brand new platform called GatherTown. Think of that conference, but plop it into a virtual world. You're going to be able to move a little avatar around. There's so much to do. So be on the lookout because that announcement, I've been finalizing stuff for the last week, and I'm so excited. We're going to be doing our official announcement coming up over the next few days. Our key presentation for that is going to be procurement of emerging technologies from Mr. Will Roberts, who is working at ASI Government. He's also the former Chief of Acquisitions at the Department of Defense Joint AI Center. But you're not here for that. You're here for the Contracting Officer Authorizations with two amazing speakers from Capital Edge Consulting. Marie Salamone, she's got more than 30 years of government contract and cost accounting, compliance, and consulting experience, as well as cost engineering, construction claims analysis, and litigation experience in an array of industries such as pharmaceutical, defense, manufacturing, service, energy, and waste management. She is an absolutely outstanding person. Can't wait for you all to get to meet her here. If you haven't had the pleasure of meeting her already, whether it's at a March workshop or any of the other Capital Edge stuff too, she's bringing along one of her colleagues, Evan Slebrch, who has got several years of experience providing professional support to government contractors in the areas of compliance, accounting, estimating, and a little program management and system implementations. Evan, his expertise includes procurement and billing compliance, incurred cost submissions, cost proposal support, management, financial modeling, forest CAS, all the fun stuff and more that, let's face it, we all love to do. I mean, did I say that was supposed to stay in a thought bubble? I'm totally kidding. But something else that Evan also has experience in, and something to really may want to reach out to him afterwards. He's assisted clients with CPSRs, Certified Purchase System Reviews. We know how very important those can be in any field that you're working in with government contracts. So that's the intros. Let's get you on over to the actual speakers. Please welcome Marie and Evan. Take it away.
Well, officially, good afternoon to everybody, and then those on the West Coast, good morning. We are very excited to be here today to discuss contracting officers' authorizations, otherwise known as COAs. This is a very unique item in government contracting. You may or may not have heard of it before. And we're going to do a deep dive into this topic. We support clients who have to put together contracting officers' authorizations on a regular basis. And we can kind of give you the tips and tricks and what you need to do as a company to comply with these type of terms and conditions that might be in your contracts. I am very happy to be joined by Evan Slebrch today. He and I work very closely together, even though we are both on separate sides of the state of Pennsylvania. I see we have somebody joining us from Florida. I hope everybody in Florida is staying safe, and best of luck to everybody down there from this recent storm. And yes, I do want to reiterate, Adam just posted that, any questions, this is meant to be an interactive session. I think the folks here already are sending comments. It appears to be very dynamic, and we definitely want to support any questions you have. So feel free to throw questions in the chat, and we'll as we see them, we'll try to answer them. And if there's any questions we don't get to or can't answer in the moment, we will be happy to follow up. Our contact information is included at the end of the deck, and we can follow up with you after this session. So next slide, Evan. So just real quick, I'm going to go through these next several slides fairly quickly so we can get to the content. Just want to give you a little bit more about Capital Edge. The firm's been established about 14 plus years ago. I joined soon after, about 6 months after what we call Capital Edge Independence Day, which was August of 2010. We're headquartered in Northern Virginia. We have 2 other offices, one in Tampa. Everybody from our Tampa area has evacuated, and we're wishing the best for them as well. We also have an office in Pittsburgh, which is where Evan sits and is there currently. We have about 70 employees now, just nearly 70, not quite yet. And we support over 200 clients each year on a regular basis. We've won some awards in the past. We've been recognized both regionally in the DC metro area as well as nationally. Really did some massive growth about 5 years plus ago, and we continue to grow. We are a go-to resource for government contracting compliance and grant compliance. We have a full grants department. And we also do public training, which you can see some of the folks that we do training for publicly. And we're happy to do it today with NCMA Boston. Next slide. I won't go through all of our key leaders, but we have our founder, CEO, and managing partner, Chad Braley, followed by 2 managing partners, and including myself, 4 partners of the firm as part of those nearly 70 folks. Next slide. We're a bit unique because we are the largest consulting firm of its kind. We're a bit of a unicorn, if you will. This is all Capital Edge does. We are not part of a larger consultancy or part of a larger CPA firm. This is all we do. 100% of our clients receive some sort of federal funding, whether through contracts or grants, and we have the experience to navigate the regulatory and contractual compliance across all industries that receive those federal dollars. Our folks they're from former government ACOs, former government auditors, industry folks. We have folks who have been in industry for 30 plus years. And then we have career consultants, which is basically myself. And so far, Evan. Next slide, Evan. So you can see we work with industries across the board of all sizes, from startups to multi-billion-dollar firms, experienced and new government contractors, all agencies. We support the DoD and all agencies. We're going to focus a little bit today on HHS because HHS right now is primarily the agency that uses these COAs, and then every type of award. Next slide. If it touches a federal dollar, I can tell you we can do it. And there are a couple areas that we don't have in-house experience. CMMC is one of them, but we know folks who can do it. We also have partners, business kind of partner relationships with Capture Firm and any IT support that relates to government contracting. Next slide. Again, this is just a smattering of the types of support that we can provide. The slide deck will be available to you if you need any more information. Next slide. This is, again, just a different look of all the different things that we can do. More recently, we have added ERP implementation, project management, and support for companies that have government contracts. And usually the government piece of ERP implementation is ignored. And then folks have to deal with those those considerations after the fact, which is typically too late. So that's a newer offering from us. Evan, next slide. And if anyone is interested, we have a lot of complimentary right off of our website guidance, white papers, checklists, articles, newsletters, and then we also have upcoming events. We regularly participate in training and provide training that's complimentary. You can use this QR code to take you directly to our website and all of those great resources. Next slide. Adam gave us a great introduction, so we're going to kind of move right past our bios. And next slide. And then I am now going to turn this over to Evan, who's going to take you through the agenda for today's session.
Thank you very much, Marie, for the introduction. I guess before we jump into things, a little bit about myself. My name's Evan Slebrch. I'm a senior consultant with Capital Edge Consulting. All in all, I have about 4 years of government contracting expertise. As Marie mentioned, I am one of those sort of bred consultants. Right out of school, joined Capital Edge Consulting with a full-time job, along with a couple of years of interning with the firm. My background, so I actually studied supply chain management when I was in school, which, as Adam mentioned as well, that's kind of naturally funneled myself into the procurement business system as a lot of my expertise and where I've been spending my time supporting clients. So with that, without further ado, we're going to jump into today's presentations of Contracting Officers Authorizations. Here you can see our agenda for today. So we're going to start out looking at what is the purpose of the COAs? What are they intended for? What are the benefits for us as a contractor and the government? And how do we use them? Then we'll move into some contracting officer authorization contract language. So what are some actual examples of what is the language that you can expect to see in your contract? What are the requirements that go along with them? And then nextly, we're going to be drafting COA requests. The way we're going to be doing it, we'll actually kind of walk through an example together of how we can prepare one and how we can go about requesting approval from a contracting officer. Additionally, there's lots of travel requirements. Should there be a travel requirement in your contract to receive approval prior to taking any travel? And to finish it off, we'll go through some processes, some best practices, and then additionally some templates and forms just to make this process as easy as possible for you as a contractor. So here we go. Let's get started. So before we roll into things, we do have a polling question for everyone. We have a couple of these today. So number one, what is your main reason for joining us in this training? Feel free to just kind of provide your answer in the comment section. So A, do you just want to learn more about how to comply with COA requirements in your prime contract? B, do you want to know and learn more about how to draft an adequate COA request? Give us us as contractors the best opportunity to receive a quick approval from the government. C, do you not have a government contract but are looking to bid on one, especially if you're going to be bidding under an HHS contract that's going to be cost reimbursable? You can certainly expect to see the COA requirement somewhere in there. Or other, are you just curious, want to learn something new today? Either way, whatever your purpose is, we're glad to have you here. I see a lot of A's coming through, so it's very exciting to hear that a lot of you have some background knowledge, and we can kind of talk through things together and figure out how we can refine some of our knowledge and expertise. All right, so jumping into things. So the purpose of the COA, or who, what, where, when, why is this requirement important? Why is it in our contract? So what is a COA? So a contracting officer's authorization, or commonly referred to as COA, we'll be using both hand in hand today. They mean the exact same thing, is a written authority from the contracting officer to move forward with a contract specified function or activity. So essentially, we as a contractor have a contract with the government to deliver goods, deliver services. And with that, we often have very expensive subcontract costs, risky subcontract costs. And the government just wants to ensure that the costs that we are going to be billing through to them are one, reasonable and allowable, and that they're beneficial to our contract, which we are supporting. So the COs will utilize the COA contract requirement to grant pre-approval to prime contractors. This is going to be prior to proceeding with the cost. So even though we've identified a need, we're going to, one, need to request approval for that purchase, and we can not move forward with that procurement and then proceed with billing the government until we actually have that contracting officer approval. Otherwise, those costs may potentially later be disallowed. Marie touched on this previously, and I think this is going to be one of the best benefits to today's training, is that COAs are a contract clause within your prime contract, and it won't be a FAR reference. It's not law. So when you try to do a lot of research on this topic online, there's really not a lot of information regularly available. So we're going to give you a lot of our expertise today, a lot of our background knowledge from working with other clients and kind of what their experience has been with COAs and how we can communicate some of our knowledge and best practices to you today. And then lastly, from our experience, COAs will most commonly be issued under an HHS prime contract. This doesn't mean it can't be issued under other ones. It's just simply a contract provision that will be added to a contract. So it technically could be under any federal award. But from our experience, if you are doing work with HHS, be sure to keep an eye out for a COA requirement. Be sure to read your contract in detail. So the purpose of a COA, we got a little bit into this on the last slide, but essentially COAs allow the government and the contracting officer to provide pre-approval for prime contractors to proceed with a contract-specific cost. And this one allows the government to ensure the costs are reasonable and allowable. And while it may add a little bit of an extra burden to the contractor to need to actually reach out beforehand, do this extra due diligence of receiving approval, it can be beneficial in the long run. If we were to proceed with a large procurement for a large dollar amount, and then turns out we go deep down the road, and we're later on in our contract, and we realize all of these costs may potentially be unallowable, unreasonable, it would be a big burden if we weren't able to get reimbursed for those costs. So this is just kind of one of those extra checks to make sure that one, we as contractors are doing our own due diligence to make sure our costs are fair, adequate, reasonable, and the government's able to make those assumptions and move forward with confidence as well. So we'll continue on. And so with that, a lot of this probably sounds very familiar to those of you who are involved with the procurement business system. Probably sounds a lot like 52244-2 subcontracts. And to that, I say, yes, they are extremely similar, but not always the same. So for instance, you can see in our table here, so all of the requirements of a COA are defined by a contract versus requirements for FAR 52244 are actually defined by the FAR. So for example, we'll get into some of the contract language later, but it's the contract provision will be very specific as to what sort of procurements require COA approval. So for example, large dollar amounts above $250,000 is common. If you have a fixed price purchase of per unit of $25,000 or more, sometimes we see travel requirements, cost reimbursable subcontracts will often be required. So it's going to be very specific in your contract what those requirements are, versus if you just have a FAR 52244-2 citation in your contract, all the regulations going to be guided by the FAR. Something else to keep in mind with that, the dollar thresholds may be very similar, but might not always be the same. So for example, while I did say that the $250,000 threshold for requesting pre-approval on a fixed price subcontract is required at the simplified acquisition threshold is most common for COAs, and then which matches up with FAR 52244-2. However, back in 2020, October of 2020, the simplified acquisition threshold was raised from $150,000 to $250,000. And it may take some extra time for that change in FAR regulation to flow down and actually HHS to make adjustments to your contract and issue an actual modification to your contract to increase that threshold during that time. So if you're operating under that $250,000 assumption and there's still a couple months in between where your COA requirement's still $150,000, that those dollar amounts between the $150,000 and $250,000 could be out of compliance if you're not adequately requesting approval in the necessary situations. And lastly, the compliance requirements. So we'll get into a little bit of detail of this later, but your contract language will be very specific as to what details they are looking for when you're requesting contracting officer approval. So be sure to read your contract in detail. Can't emphasize that enough. It's going to lay it out very clearly what your responsibilities as a contractor are in terms of requesting approval from a contracting officer for procurement. So with that, we now have our second polling question of the day. So does your company have any prime contracts, including contracting officers authorizations contract clauses? A for yes, B for no, and C, if you're not sure, that's okay. If you have an HHS prime contract, I certainly recommend just giving it a quick look. Give everyone some time to provide some responses in the comments. All right, seeing a little bit of everything, some yes, no's, some maybes. Great, thanks everyone. I'm now gonna pass it off to Marie to kind of go through some of our COA contract language you can anticipate to see in your HHS prime contract.
So next slide. Thank you, Evan. So it's interesting. As Evan mentioned, this is going to be a specific contract requirement that you're not going to see in the FAR. And so this can change contract to contract. So if you're used to, we did have at least 1 or 2 A's. There are folks that have experience with the contracting officer's authorizations. And so that it may change the types of items that are going to be required. And this goes beyond subcontracting, right? A COA is going to include a number of items that's not just related to subcontractors, although subcontractors are a large part of this. And so just looking at the language in front of you, this actually came from an actual government contract. You can see that it was issued at a time when the simple acquisition threshold was $150,000. If your contract isn't modded, that's what you are expected to operate under for a COA, even if the SAT changes. So you would expect a mod from your contract officer if it raises, right? Because if the higher the threshold, the better for the contractor, right? The lower the threshold, you're going to have to do these for any purchase, right? And we can see here equipment purchases, subcontracting, or any subcontractors that we're going to use, right? So in this case, subcontractors, consulting agreements, anything over $150,000 that's anticipated to be awarded under your prime contract is going to have to go through this COA process. And we want to be very clear, and we're going to, Evan is actually going to talk a lot about how you prepare a COA later in the program, but all of this has to be in writing. It has to be very clear. And if you have any questions as you're proposing on a government contract that has a COA requirement within it, we encourage you to communicate with your your contracting officer to understand if you're interpreting this correctly, right? We're going to see here in a little bit, travel is included. In this case, any equipment purchase when the unit price is over $25,000, you will need a COA. In today's world, procuring equipment over $25,000, you might be doing a lot of COAs because it's for each piece of equipment that exceeds that $25,000 threshold. And the other thing is the timing of this. You need to allow sufficient time for the government to fully review the COA before you actually contract or commit to the PO with your vendor contractors, or even planning for travel. And we're going to show here in a minute what all the types of documents that are required. This is documentation heavy. You also need to have good organized files so that you can keep your files in order and to be able to support any audits down the road, that you submitted everything in time and then received that approval in writing, right? And so one of the it's a very simple message, but we tell each and every client over and over and over again, read your contract. And then not only read it, but you need to understand what's requested of you and required of you in order to comply with the contract. It was interesting when Evan and I started this journey of seeing what was out across the internet of what was out there for folks on COAs. There was nearly nothing. And so this is something we wanted to put together. We've developed a lot of tools, checklists, sample policies and procedures. We're going to get that to the details of that further in the program. But this is a very important kind of because it's not used specifically by the DoD at this time, or our experience doesn't indicate that, and it's HHS related, there's just not a lot out there. And it may surprise many of our participants today that HHS actually spends more dollars than the DoD. And those dollars have just exploded, as you could probably imagine, over the last 5 years. There's quite a lot of money being spent, and there's going to be oversight on those dollars based on what folks signed up for in their contracts. And a lot of times there were some OTAs that were issued during the last so many years as a preferred method of getting funding in the hands of our biotech and pharmaceutical firms to develop the COVID vaccine. And more dollars are continuing to be spent for pandemic preparedness moving forward in the future. So let's go to the next slide, Evan. So these are the types of items that you're going to be expected to provide, right? Competition activities. When did you put your subcontractor solicitations together? Did you go out and get 3 bids? Did you provide technical and cost price evaluations as required to select those subcontractors? That's typical 52-244-2 and other FAR related clauses to subcontracting. We want to make sure that the subcontractors that you are vetting are qualified, that they've developed a statement of work that responds to what you're expecting for the activities that are included in the proposed subcontract. Also, the subcontractor's willingness to perform under the contract, commitment letters, preliminary agreements, NDAs may be part of this. And then specific list of duties that are included. Are they addressing everything that you need to get from them to perform under your prime contract? The priority that the work will be given and how it's going to interact and relate to the other work that you are performing, the amount of time and facilities that may be required, and then a complete subcontractor proposal or quote in the format that's similar to the prime contractor's cost proposal, because you would have put together a cost proposal for these types of costs, and it all needs to align. And these are the types of things that the contracting officer, they're going to review to make sure that it's all in alignment with the goods and services that they're expecting to procure from you as the prime contractor. I'm going to pause for questions. We do encourage them, so feel free to reach out in the chat. We do like the interaction. We find it more engagement with the participants makes this a better presentation for everybody. So feel free to ask any questions at any time. Awesome. All right, we're going to go to the next slide. And I'm going to turn it back to Evan.
Thank you very much, Marie, for the information on some of the details and contract language that we can expect to see. So now we're going to jump into drafting our COA requests. So the COA request is essentially the vehicle that we're going to use as contractors to actually request approval from the contracting officer to proceed with a function-related cost. So generally, it's just going to be a PDF Word document that outlines all of the details that Marie really just went over. One of our recommendations that we think is really beneficial is to have somebody responsible for drafting each of these COA requests within your organization. Somebody who has a really good background knowledge and expert on this one contract clause, who knows what information the contracting officer is going to be looking for, potentially has an established relationship and was able to communicate with the CO what are our COA requirements and what are our expectations. So each of these COA requests should have each of the information deemed necessary by our contract. What Marie just went over was an exact copy from a contractor who had the COA contract clause included in their contract. But again, I'm just going to reiterate, please read. Those may vary time to time based off of your contract. You may have a couple of HHS prime contracts and then realize you might have different COA requirements associated. So what you're seeing in those boxes below in the PowerPoint is just kind of a sample of a template that you may be able to utilize for requesting approval from a contracting officer. And what it's really intended to do, just basically lay out questions to be answered by whoever's going to be drafting the COA request. And it's really just going to direct them to make sure they are answering each of the requirements laid out in the contract. So why is the work necessary? How much is it going to cost? What quotes were received? What did competition look like? Why is this necessary? How is the work going to be performed by the subcontractor, or if there's travel necessary? How is the cost going to support what we are doing as a prime contractor in delivering a good deliverable to the government? So what I want to do next, we're actually going to start going through each of these 6 requirements that we went through previously and kind of thinking about how can we answer each of these and have a smooth process of providing all the information that a CO is going to be looking answered. So to do this, I think I want to kind of set up an example so that we can kind of have a flow to everything and have some continuity. So for the next hour or so, however much time we have left in training, I think we're going to consider ourselves a new organization, give up whoever you're working for now. We're now NCMA Construction. We just got a construction contract with HHS. And for this example, we're going to say the CDC sub-agency of HHS, and we're building a new headquarters. There's the headquarters in Atlanta, but there's obviously been a lot of crazy weather going on, praying for Florida. But if all of our diseases are stored there, say something really negative happens, we got to have all these diseases stored somewhere else. So we're a new group. We're HQ2. So let's all draft a COA together and see how we different examples of stuff that subcontract costs we might need and how we're going to go about getting approval. So to get us started, COA requests, we're going to get started with our competition activities. So the first thing we always want to do is communicate the steps that we took as a contractor to ensure adequate competition was achieved. So how many different solicitations did we send out? How many proposals did we receive back? How many no bids did we receive? A real just like kind of breakout of inception of, we identified that we have this need and we did our due diligence to make sure we were getting a fair and reasonable price. Were any negotiations taken place? Any insight into what kind of competition activities may have been taken? And then with that, we have all of our proposals received from our subcontractors, hopefully at least 3, to establish that fair and reasonable price. So we're going to create a cost and price analysis using those proposals from multiple sources and kind of comparing them to see which price is the best. And one thing I kind of want to emphasize, it's good to kind of break out those costs by activity. So if we know we're our new construction organization, we need somebody to come in and lay all the concrete for us. So there's going to be material costs involved in that. There's going to be labor costs. So when we're submitting our request for proposals from the potential subcontractors, we want to request that information be broken out so that we as contractors can analyze that information, figure out if there's any really specific opportunities for cost saving that would be advantageous for us as the contractor and the federal government as well. So generally, once we have our cost price analysis set up, we're going to select the lowest available price. This might not always be the case, but generally, if a subcontractor is able to meet all of your requirements laid out in your solicitation, we'll often go with whoever has the lowest cost. And if competition activities weren't conducted, it's imperative that we have a single or sole source justification to go along with that. So let's say we're building our new HQ2 for the CDC in middle of nowhere in the country, and there's only one person who can deliver wet concrete. Nobody else is willing to deliver us wet concrete. We'd reached out to multiple potential suppliers. We now are stuck in a situation where we only received one adequate source and who's capable of delivering. So we'll have to prepare a either single or sole source anytime we're not able to establish effective competition. Moving forward, so we want to ensure that our subcontractors have good qualifications and capabilities. So this can mean a lot of different things. So for one, does the proposed subcontractor have experience working with us as the contractor? Perhaps we, as the NCMA Boston Construction, we have a lot of experience working with one group specifically. Let's say we need lots of steel to build this building, and we have this one steel producer that's been providing us everything we need for years and years. We have an MSA established with them. We get discounts for bulk orders. That's all stuff that would be very advantageous to us. We know that the subcontractor does great work. They've always done great work on behalf of us, and it's important to share that information with the contracting officer as well. Let them know that the proposed subcontractor is a great fit. Does the subcontractor have experience working under government contracts? It's just one of those added things. A lot of the time, subcontractors have pass-through requirements from the FAR, and if they have a lot of experience and know how to comply with our government billing requirements, labor requirements, so on and so forth, that's just another check mark that we can check off the list. It's like these guys are really good at what they do. And we know that because, one, they've worked for us in the past, and they work under multiple government contracts. And then another point, does the subcontractor specialize in the requested goods or services? Often niche is a good thing. Small business can be a good thing. If essentially, one thing I like to do when preparing qualifications and capabilities is we're trying to essentially sell our proposed subcontractor to the contracting officer, to the federal government. And just like the proposed subcontractor, when they're filling out their proposals and sending them back to us, they're going to be trying to sell themselves. So a lot of the information that we can fill out in our COA request, we can just kind of transfer right into from the proposal into the COA request, because they're going to be trying to say why they're the best. And then we can just translate that information over to the government. It's like, look at all the great experience they have. They've worked for us for 20 years. We have MSAs and they've done a great job, and along with lots of government experience. So just that extra capabilities that may make a proposed subcontractor extra special. Good things to translate. So moving forward, the subcontractor's willingness to perform. So generally, if a proposed subcontractor is willing to submit a proposal as a response to a request for proposal, you would hope that they're willing to perform the contractual obligations. So a lot of this goes into setting up just a really good request for proposal to make sure that each of the items you need and identify early on that they're going to be met. So you want the contractor needs to be able to clearly identify that the proposed subcontractor can meet all the requirements of a request for proposal. So really be sure to meet with whoever is, as the COA drafter, whoever that is going to be responsible for that. Communicate with whoever is requesting the goods and figure out, why is this necessary? Why is it important? How is this going to be beneficial to the program? And in the end, supporting our federal deliverable to the government. So what are the subcontractors' responsibilities under the prime contract? So again, we're NCMA Boston. I mean, not Boston today, we're NCMA Construction. So we have a lot of windows that need to be part of our building. So we need to be very specific, have our blueprints ready and say we need this number of windows, this size, and be as specific as possible to just kind of clear up any shortcomings, questions, or potential adjustments, which things always happen. We always need to often make revisions to purchase orders, and things happen, but that's okay. But as much detail as we can get up front, it's going to make this process easy, smooth, and assist us in getting our approval from the contracting officer. And then lastly, along with that, just kind of a list of specific duties. So our window people, they're going to bring in, they're going to transport all of the windows. They're going to install the windows. They're going to test the windows to make sure that no air is sliding through. Any of the requirements that we're kind of expecting to see, any of our expectations of the subcontractor, we want to be sure that is translated to the subcontractor, and then as well to the CO when we're submitting these COA requests. So priority and relation. So are the goods and services deemed to be high or low priority by the contractor, and why? So I think this important part of this, as we're getting into high and low priority, Marie mentioned lately, this is a time-taking process. Often it can take a couple weeks, sometimes a couple months by the time a contractor realizes, oh, we have a need for this to be able to complete our responsibilities under our contract. And then you have to solicit responses from proposed subcontractors. You have to do a cost analysis, draft a COA. It takes time for the government to review our COA requests and then get back with an approval. So just stuff to keep in mind. So for going back to another example, if we're looking to build a building, laying down all of our concrete, our base, is going to be one of the most important things. We can't build up until we have our base. So that would be something that we could kind of define as high priority. We need this concrete to be laid very quickly. We physically cannot move forward with our construction until this concrete has been laid. If something's low priority, say you're way ahead and anticipating an upcoming cost. We know we're going to have to build a roof on this building, but that's years away because we're building this massive construction. If you're planning way ahead, still better to be up front and mention that we still have some time to get this processed, but it still will, in the end, will be necessary for us to be able to effectively complete our contracted services. And then how does the good or service support the prime contractor's efforts and execution? So I think one potential example of this, so we have our building. We're going to have a bunch of medicine and stuff in there because we're with the CDC, and we need a special climate controlled room per se. We are, as construction builders, are not able to, it's not our expertise. We don't do the HVAC. We don't have these special climate controlled rooms. So we need to contract somebody else to come in and do that work. It was in our prime contract that we needed to have these climate controlled rooms. So, but we were aware we weren't going to be capable of it and had to subcontract the work out. So we physically would not be able to deliver on our responsibilities unless we pass this work on to someone else. So for this priority and relation, why is the work important and how is the subcontracted work related to our day-to-day activities? How does it support our work, this specific function, task, CLIN, contract line item, and the contract in total? So moving on with the time and facilities required. So where and when will the subcontracted work take place? Is it going to be remote? Is somebody going to have to be on site? Is it going to be hybrid? Are the subcontractors going to need to travel at all? That's all important information that the contracting officer is going to be looking to have answered for this section. And it goes as detailed as if they are going to be on site, is there enough adequate space available on site for the subcontracted work to be performed? So it's going to be looking for a specific response in terms of, is their office space set aside? If they're traveling, or do they have a hotel place to stay? If they are traveling, are they going to be meeting the GSA guidelines? Maria's going to be getting a lot into our travel requirements later on. But the government is going to be looking to make sure that the proposed subcontractors are coming with a very specific job to do and have a location, facility, a place for them to perform their work and get diligent work done. And then lastly, again, being as specific as we can with our request for proposals, how long is the subcontracted work going to be required? We, as contractors, often have to work within very specific timelines, and we want to ensure that our subcontractors are meeting their own obligations so that we can be successful with our own operations. So be specific if it's going to anticipated to be a 3-month project, a 1 week, however long it's anticipated for the work to go on and where they're going to be working. It's important to translate and communicate that information to your contracting officer. And then for our last note, this contracting officer is going to be looking for a complete cost proposal. So we solicited lots of different proposals. We got all of our responses, and we did our cost analysis, and all of the information we just kind of translated or communicated to the CO in the previous sections will often come directly from the proposal. And it's just an added vehicle that the contracting officer can look into, confirm that all the information that we're stating is adequate, the prices match, their capabilities and their promises in the proposal and future contract meet the requirements and is cost beneficial to the contractor and to the federal government. So with that, the proposal should be attached to the COA as an appendix, and somewhere within our COA request, we're actually going to reference where in our appendices that the COA request is located. Often, if we want to reference different attachments, if we needed to perform a review of travel, our cost price analyses, all of those should be included in an appendices somewhere. Anything that we refer to within our COA request, we just want to provide that documentation to the contracting officer as well, just show that we are doing our due diligence. So along with that, so for a labor subcontract proposal, we would expect to see estimated hours. So how many hours is expected to be performed by labor category? What are the hourly rates for each labor category? And then are there any additional travel costs that are anticipated, as well as material costs? And then that would bring us to the total cost of a labor proposed subcontract. And then if we have materials, so we have the number of units to be purchased, and then the cost per unit and total cost. So very specific for all of this information. As I mentioned before, so the very last thing that's going to be contractually obligated is the complete cost proposal from the subcontractor. But that information provided there is going to be extremely beneficial. Utilize it to your advantage when preparing your COA requests.
Awesome. So just to tag on to some of what Evan was talking about, this all needs to be in writing. It needs to be organized and put together in a fashion that's going to make it easy for your contracting officer to provide the approval as quickly as possible. If you are missing items that the contracting officer is expecting, it's going to delay the approval process and then in turn likely cause a delay to your program. We all know that delays in time basically equate to increased cost. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about this timeline of the COA request and build it into your structure. We're going to get more into the how with checklists in a bit, but there's a lot that goes into these, and you're going to reach out to a number of folks within the organization. And if you're the person in your organization that has to put these together, I can guarantee you there's going to be a lot of coordination from a lot of folks to get all this information synthesized, organized, in writing, in a format that's going to make you successful getting your authorizations from the contracting officer for these items that are requested. Okay, next slide, Evan. So travel is one of those items that are often listed in the contract language requesting COAs. And I'm just going to read this. Basically, you need a COA anytime you travel domestically, so CONUS, Continental United States, for any trip, doesn't say trip, but I'm going to explain that in a minute, that exceeds $10,000. And any foreign travel, even if it's below the $10,000 threshold, okay? And those costs have to be allowable unless otherwise approved by the contracting officer. So basically, allowable means they are in accordance with the cost principles. What are allowable, allocable, and reasonable costs per FAR Part 31, the cost principles, as well as the U.S. federal travel regulations. And so this $10,000 threshold, it doesn't say per trip, but I will tell you based on our experience, that $10,000 threshold is a trip. It could be one person taking that trip, or it could be 10 people attending a meeting. Oftentimes when you're working with BARDA, for example, you're going to be meeting with BARDA in DC. So as a prime contractor, if you are sending 5 people to DC for a week of meetings, that's likely going to be over $10,000. And that trip it will be required to have a COA in process with all the items that are requested by the contracting officer to justify the trip. It has to have a business purpose. Again, you have to have that relation to the work that you're doing, as Evan has described, and then demonstrate the need as well as all of the costs that are going to be estimated for that trip. So, travel, typical, transportation, any mode of transportation getting to and from the location, lodging, meals, incidental expenses, and all of those have to be per the travel regs. We could do an entire couple-hour session on maximizing travel costs per the regs. In fact, we have one of those trainings that we do with another organization. But all the costs that you incur have to be incurred in accordance with those travel regulations. So again, you're not going to get business class and first class airfare, even if it's if you had budgeted it in, which I don't recommend. You want to be able to estimate your cost in accordance with the travel regs. Can be a little tricky with airfare, and now lodging is fairly dynamic. You could check an airfare now, and 2 hours from now that airfare could be wildly different. So that can be a little bit of a challenge, but anticipated, right? You should know approximately what it costs to fly from New York to San Diego, for example. I see if there's a question, and thank you so much. Are COAs being utilized in civilian agencies or only certain ones? Great question. It is our experience that right now we see this primarily through HHS. So that is a civilian agency. This whole concept may be used by other agencies, right? Have not seen it in the DOE, the Department of Energy. We do a lot of support for clients that have DOE contracts. Have not yet seen it in DOD contracts, the Department of Defense. But other agencies like DHS, they may be using them. We just haven't seen it anywhere else, but that's not to say it couldn't be included in your contract. Right now, I would expect that if you have an HHS contract, and that's any sub-agency, so BARDA, NIH, CMS, any of those sub-agencies that we're seeing a lot of contracts coming through, you may see this particular, and it is a contract specific. You're not going to find a FAR clause on this. You're not going to find a supplemental agency like an HHSARS clause on this. This is, hey, it is described in detail as a term and condition of your contract. Okay, great question. Please keep asking them. So as a contractor preparing a COA for travel, you need a detailed breakdown of the trip, estimated costs, and an explanation of why the travel is necessary, right? And if some of your support when you go to bill that cost, you want to make sure that if your people are putting those expenses through an expense report, that the expense report is constructed in a way that allows for the reason for the business trip. That is, it's one of those subtle items that is required for proper supportive travel. You want to make sure that your folks are trained to put in a very it doesn't have to be super detailed. It just has to be very specific that it was taken for, as an example, this trip was to attend a meeting for HHS on this specific contract. That's a business purpose, right? Not, oh, we went to DC, great, but have no idea why. The expense reports, should they have an ability to state that specifically. Again, all of the travel that you incur, that you estimate as part of your COA, should be in accordance with the GSA per diem rates for domestic. And then the Department of State has a similar per diem rates for foreign travel. It includes lodging per diems as well as the MIAE, the meal and incidental expenses. So for per diems for different cities. Let's see, next slide. This is big no-no. Any COA travel request should not include any unallowable travel costs, right? So now I'll give you a great example. We tell a lot of our clients, and this is not just for COAs, but when you're claiming costs for your indirect rates, as an example, your company may allow, under different circumstances, business travel and or first class air travel. That's fine. That's part of what your company allows as an employee. However, the government is not going to pay for first class airfare or business class airfare. Lowest cost coach is what's allowable per the travel regs. And so what we recommend, it takes a little extra work. So you basically have a couple of choices. You can allow your folks to travel in accordance with your policies and procedures and not put that airfare through at all because it's business or first class. Or you could take the time, at the time of booking that airfare, you could get a screenshot of the equivalent cost of the lowest coach class fare, and then book the first class airfare. And that way, what is allowed to be claimed is the coach class airfare. The difference between the coach class and first class then becomes allowable. So in order to maximize those travel costs, you can recover a portion of the first class airfare. Absolutely permissible and recommended if that's the situation in your company. What we want to make sure, though, is that documentation is key. That coach class airfare has to be done contemporaneously at the same time you're booking the first class airfare. You can't come back a day later, a month later, or a year later and say, oh, this is what the coach class airfare would have been. Not permissible because of the dynamic pricing of the airline industry. Rental car costs in excess of the available compact or intermediate price rental cars is unallowable. However, there's always an exception. If you've got 5 employees, it's going to be cheaper to rent one large car rather than 5 small cars. So we just have to demonstrate why we went to a larger than compact or intermediate price rental car. A portion of company furnished automobiles that relate to personal use by employees. So if you're have a company car, right, we're going to make sure that what is being charged to the government does not include any costs of personal use by employees. Any lodging and meals in excess of the daily per diems that are established for each area at the time of travel. And again, we provided the link here. I think it's really helpful to the GSA website. You can then actually find a link to the Department of State for the foreign travel per diems from the GSA website. And then finally, as we always say, fun is always unallowable in the FAR. So any alcohol or entertainment, I will. Yeah, fun is unallowable, unfortunately. But so one item that's very important to note is that there is a concept in government contracting that directly associated unallowable costs are also unallowable. There's a lot of examples of this, but say we have, a restaurant bill, we got a $10 glass of wine and $90 in food. If the tax and tip associated with the alcohol is also unallowable. So you get $100, $90 in food, 10% of the tax and tip is then also unallowable. So be careful when you're charging those through. Okay, next slide. There's a lot of detail that needs to be put into a COA request for travel. We list them here. It's very important that the documentation is included and that you've well laid out this information. Again, the easier you make it for the contracting officer, the better it is for you. And also have a great format. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, of all the types of information so the government gets used to, one, they have confidence in what you're presenting them, and there's not a lot of back and forth. Will there be some back and forth? They'll ask for additional explanation or documentation, yes, but we want to keep that to a minimum. Okay, next slide. The contracting officer is going to really make a determination of, is this travel necessary? Can the work be performed without travel? And then does it meet the cost principles and the travel regs in terms of the need for the contract, that travel, so that all the travel costs have to be allowable. The CO is absolutely going to not approve any travel request that they deem as unnecessary, or if it includes any unallowable costs. And then this is a time, if you have this COA requirements in your contract, to make sure that you have a well-established and compliant travel policies and procedures and practices to reduce the risk of claiming unallowable travel costs, and then also risking that the COA won't be approved and then require resubmission. One thing to note, make sure your employees are trained on the travel regulations. I know it can be difficult. They are kind of minimal when you're trying to get reimbursement. And then if you have, as I mentioned before, if you have a different policy and procedure, that's okay. The government's just not going to pay for it. And there are ways to maximize your travel costs to be compliant. Okay, polling question number 3. What is your role in the organization related to contracting officers' authorizations? I assist in preparing COA requests. I'm involved in the procurement of subcontracted goods and services. I manage COA approved funding, or something else. Oh, wow, we have a really good smattering of answers. I really appreciate everybody's responses, and I think we're ready to move on. Thank you for the clarification.
All right, so with that, we now know how to draft our COA requests, identify when a COA approval is going to be required. So now we're going to jump a little bit more further into the process. So as I mentioned further, starting up there in the top left, we've identified a good or service that is subject to our COA requirement. Somewhere along in our established policies, we should have someone who is responsible for reviewing proposed procurements, purchases, spend, and be able to determine whether or not that spend is going to be subject to our contractual COA requirements. And if so, we've identified that the COA, that the proposed spend is bound by our COA requirement in our contract. And we're going to have to draft a COA request, which we've all done together. Thank you, everybody, for joining me through that. And then we are now ready to submit for approval. So that's a bit of a process in its own. Each of these we're going to go through a slide as well. So we submit our COA request for approval. The contracting officer is going to review it, ensure all of our contractual requirements are met. We've adequately displayed the proposed subcontractor's willingness, our competition activities, so on and so forth. It's okay if the contracting officer responds with some additional questions. Sometimes they're just looking for clarifications, have a question about cost. It can be anything, how it's going to support the program. Be sure to communicate very well within your own organizations with the stakeholders, just to ensure you can get a fair, timely response back to your contracting officer. And then lastly, your CO is going to provide you with approval, and we're going to go into some details of what to do once we receive CO approval. So COA request submission. So as we kind of saw when we were looking at the contract language, from our experience, COA contract language, the COA request submission processes aren't really defined by the prime contract anywhere. So what we really highly recommend is to communicate with your contracting officer very early on after establishing a contract with the federal government. Figure out how the requests should be submitted. What does the timeline look like? How long can I expect until I see a response after submitting a COA request? I think it's good to communicate with your contracting officer up front early on, ask all the important questions, and just kind of show that you as a contractor and your team have a commitment to compliance and adhering to your contractual obligations. The contractor should remain timestamped evidence of the COA request submission. So we'll go through some examples of submissions on the next slide. But essentially, take a screenshot of an email, take a screenshot of the submission. We recommend having a COA folder for each COA request where you can place all of the documentation, the proposals, supporting documents, so on and so forth. So additionally, I said this before. So we do want to have someone who is responsible within our organization for drafting. We also want to set a responsibility for someone to be responsible for submitting COA requests. And that should be established kind of in our policies and procedures, what each individual's roles and responsibilities are related to COA submission. So continuing on, as I said, there might be a couple of ways that submission is expected. Again, please communicate with your contracting officer as to what those expectations are for submission. Generally, from our experience, it will be one, the other, or both of these, where it's either an email submission or provided through a government-provided portal. So when submitting via email, be sure to ask your contracting officer who all should be included from the government on that email request to make sure the government has all of their necessary stakeholders included. And as well, feel free to copy any of your organization's stakeholders as well, so that when you do get a reply and an approval or potentially questions from the federal government, your stakeholders are aware and know that this is still in process. And then if you happen to be required to submit via a government provided portal, your contracting officer should be able to provide that information for you, what site to utilize. And one thing to keep in mind, we stated on the last slide, it's important to establish who within your organization is going to be responsible for submitting the COA requests. And that's because often these government provided portals will have very limited access as to the number of users who can access the portal and actually submit these COA requests. So we want to establish one who is our main contact if for whatever reason we have a rush to get a COA out, and that person's out of the office, who's the backup. So we have an example down below. BARDA utilizes the bdrhhs.gov site. So just some stuff to be aware of. Whenever we do submit, be sure to take some screenshots and add that to the COA folder as well, just to further support our documentation efforts. So for COA approval, we've now submitted our COA request. So the contracting officer is going to review our request for cost reasonableness and ensure that the requested goods or services are necessary in supporting our prime contracted efforts. The contracting officer very well may reach out with questions, clarifications before they provide that final approval. So if so, again, just reach out to your internal stakeholders, communicate with them to get a response back to the contracting officer as soon as possible, get those questions answered so you can as well get your approval turned around quickly. So generally from our experience, a contracting officer will provide the approval via email. And again, documentation, please take a screenshot of all of your approvals. Just avoid any questions later on down the road. Generally, the contracting officer will provide an approval within 10 business days. But again, please just make sure to communicate with your contracting officer, establish what your expectations are very early on in terms of timelines and communication details, submissions, so on. So now that we have received our approved COA from the contracting officer, we want to make sure that our COA folder has all of the necessary support, the request, any attachments, approval, submission, all of that we want to have stored in an administrative file somewhere with our procurement team, most likely. And as well, we want to disseminate the approval information to the appropriate stakeholders. Whoever was requesting goods, services, travel, we want to let them know that it's okay for them to now move forward with their function-related costs and utilize that spend. Once we have that approval and we're setting up our purchase requisitions, occasionally purchase orders, it's okay to reference your COA number on there. Anytime somebody jumps into the purchase requisition, they should be aware that the funding is subject to a COA request. And if any funding needed to potentially be increased, it would still be subject to that COA approval amount. And then lastly, when you're submitting your incurred costs to the government under that COA, be sure to reference your COA number on each of those invoices. Be sure to track your spend. We don't want to go over budget with any of our billings, and just kind of make sure all of our costs continue to be allowable, reasonable. So that brings us to our fourth polling question of the day. So does your company currently have a COA policy that addresses contracting officer authorization requirements under a federally funded prime contract? A for yes, B for no, C if you're not sure. This next section, I'll give people some time to answers, but this next section, we're going to get into how to establish some great policies and procedures and some other forms that can really help each of you comply and make this process of COAs as smooth as possible. So with that, I'll pass it over to Marie. I see, again, some answers, yes, no's, maybes. That's really fantastic to see.
All right, next slide. Thank you, Evan. So I know we have just about 10 minutes left. I'm going to try to get through this quickly. Again, feel free to ask any questions you may have, and then we will follow up if questions come to you later and after we finish the program today. So you should have a COA request template, right? You need a tracking log. There could be quite a lot of COAs that you're going to be managing. So you want to make sure that you have a tracking log, making sure that COA is getting routed to all the key stakeholders as necessary, right? A travel request template, because that's going to look a little differently. And then a COA checklist. Did we include all the necessary items that the contracting officer is going to need in order to approve the COA? Do we have all the documentation that we're going to submit as attachments to support and demonstrate all of the information that the contracting officer is going to need to make that determination? And then finally, do we have a policy and procedure? Who's doing this? When does it get done? When does it have to be done? Do we have a standardized template, standardized policy and procedure so that folks know this is what's expected? Right? This is key because there's a lot of folks that are going to be touching this process. And we want to make sure that we have a well-oiled machine as it comes to this process within the organization. Next slide. Again, provides standard consistent formats for the COA. They will begin to trust you when they understand that you have a handle on this process. It will eliminate the need for back and forth, and it encourages that efficient government review. I would make sure that you have a standardized header on all communications related to the COA, and make sure that there's identifiable sections that address every requirement. Next slide. The travel request template, this is very important. You want a separate one because it looks and feels very different than, purchase orders for equipment and securing subcontractors. Make sure all these items are addressed, and please be paying attention to the unallowable costs. Next slide. So that tracking log, also very important because it helps you manage this process. Where are we on each of the COAs? Did we get final approval? Where are those information? Where is all this information stored? You want to make sure that if there are COAs internally that are in process, you know where the information is and when people are supposed to be getting you the information you need to finalize the COA. We have some information here that like a framework of how to make sure you have a well thought out tracking log that you can utilize. Next slide. Okay, a COA template and checklist. Do you have everything that you need that has to go into the COA? Is somebody doing a final review with a checklist? Each item has been provided. Yes, I have it in front of me. Check, check, check. Make sure that you have a well-defined checklist that is produced. You have one final checklist that's produced for every COA that goes into the file. Everything needs to be documented. It needs to be documented well. It needs to be stored, and it needs to be easily retrieved. This may be subject to audit to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to do. Next slide. Your policy and procedure. And Evan, if you have something you want to interject with, please do.
No, I think either way, I was going to jump in and just kind of roll with the policies and procedures. But as Marie stated previously, it's really, really important to have really sound policies and procedures. We want to identify who's doing what, when it's going to happen, what is the purpose of the COA in our policy. So it's contractually obligating, and state why, who's responsible for along each of their responsibilities with the COA process. Who's going to be requesting goods, who's going to be reviewing, submitting, so on and so forth. We want to define when a COA is required, and essentially it's going to be established by the prime contract. One thing that we do recommend at Capital Edge, if you, as a sub policy for each of your contracts that lays out what the thresholds are and what your contract requirements are for requesting approval as well. So if you happen to have be operating under multiple HHS contracts simultaneously, there is a chance that your COA requirements will be slightly different. So we recommend creating a sub policy for each contract under a main COA policy that does a detailed walkthrough of what the process should look like from when you first identify a need all the way up through to the point of we are putting the COA number on each of the invoices. So again, please provide as much detail as possible and identify the roles involved. So drafting, submission, COA storage, so on and so forth. So some key roles and responsibilities we'd expect to see in some of those policies. So the requester, there's someone who's going to eventually realize we need to subcontract for some work. We need to travel. We need to buy a significant number of materials. So they should be able to effectively communicate why the requested goods, services, travel is necessary to whoever is drafting the COA request. Additionally, we have a procurement lead. So they are going to be responsible for ensuring each of the procurements that go through the organization, identifying if they are required to receive COA approval, so that we don't end up going later down the road and realizing that we need some stuff we should have had an approval. And then lastly, the processor, they're going to be doing the bulk of it. They're going to be figuring out what the information is. They're going to be drafting, performing budget checks, answering questions related to COAs throughout the organization. Can't emphasize enough, please have all of your roles and responsibilities clearly laid out in your policies and procedures. So just to summarize, so our COA request template just kind of lays out line by line. We'll help you answer all of your contractual questions. Same thing with your travel request. It'll break out all of your travel to make sure it's compliant. A tracking log that identifies the current status of each of our COAs, when they were approved, dollar amounts, so on and so forth. A checklist that ensures that we met each of our contractual obligations and communicated that all the attachments that should be included in a COA request are included. And then lastly, sound policies and procedures documenting from inception to we receive approval, along with roles and responsibilities of our COA requirements. So lastly, some key takeaways. So I hope everybody today was able to get a clear understanding of what COA requirements are and how the thresholds are established by your contract. Can't communicate this enough. Please read your contract, communicate with your CO, establish early on what expectations and requirements are. Have well-established policies and procedures. It'll help give you the smoothest flowing process that you can. And then lastly, we kind of gave you an idea of some good templates that will help make the COAs a smooth, seamless process and get you a quick and easy approval. So lastly, this brings us to our last polling question of today. Did your understanding of contracting officers' authorizations increase? A for yes, B for no. I'll just briefly give my own thank you. I appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day to come join us for today's Contracting Officers Authorizations training. Hope everybody did get the chance to learn something new, and hope to have the opportunity to present with NCMA Boston in the future.
Awesome. I'll do the same. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate your time. Definitely appreciate the questions and comments throughout. We do truly appreciate the engagement, and we are grateful to NCMA Boston for this opportunity. I think we have a slide or two. So feel free to reach out if you have questions that come up after today's program is over. That always happens to me. I always think of the question I wanted to ask, like, an hour or 2 hour or a day later. And feel free that my contact information is on this QR code. The QR code earlier in the program will take you to our online resources for everything government contracting that we have to offer on our website. And more contact information for Evan and myself. We do take phone calls. I'm happy to talk to anybody for a few minutes in support of your government contracting journey, including COAs.
All right, great. That'll do it for us here for the Contracting Officer Authorizations webinar. Marie, Evan, great job. Thank you all so much. Little bit of housekeeping before everyone signs off. There is going to be, for those of you that registered and came to the webinar today, you're going to get your CPE credits from our IT person, Kathleen. That certification will come out later. And Marie and Evan are making the presentation itself available. In case you missed my comment earlier in chat, it is going to be available later on. We'll get that out to you once we get it, as well as a copy of this entire webinar is going to be available on our YouTube page. Search NCMA Boston. You're going to look for Marie and Evan's one. That'll be the correct one. So absolutely no worries. Thank you all so much for joining. And we'll see you next month for the AI in Contracting Conference.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.